Well, it's time now to take a look at what's making headlines in the French press. Haxi Myers-Belkin joins me. Good morning to you, Haxi. We're starting with news of President Erdogan, of Turkey, of course, securing that narrow victory in Sunday's referendum.
Yes, and unsurprisingly, this really is the story that's dominating the French papers today. Let's begin with centre-right daily Le Figaro, and that headline, Erdogan claims a narrow victory. We read here that around 51% of voters handed Erdogan the result he'd been dreaming of. But that figure says it all, really. Turkey's ruling AK party really did win this vote by a hair's breadth, thanks in large part to the conservative heartlands of Anatolia. The country's largest cities, meanwhile, voted no. L'Opinion today is unequivocal about what this result says about the state of modern Turkey. It's a divided country, quite simply, and those divisions are unlikely to just vanish in the coming weeks and months. In fact, those who oppose Erdogan and his government may even be emboldened by this result. Let's not forget that almost half of people voted against Erdogan's planned reforms.
Right, well, how are the French papers treating these accusations, if you will, of fraud regarding that referendum?
Well, L'Obs today is dedicating a large part of its coverage of that referendum to claims that the vote was manipulated. We read here that the head of the leading opposition party is talking of electoral violations in light of the Turkish Electoral Commission's decision to accept unstamped ballots. He's demanding a recount of some 60% of votes. The other opposition party worth mentioning, the pro-Kurd HDP, is also demanding a recount of 2/3 of ballots, although whether that's actually likely to happen now that Erdogan has had this show of support is another thing entirely.
Well, Haxi, what are papers saying about how this is likely to affect, if at all, French relations with Turkey or EU, let's say, on a broader scale?
Yeah, so let's go back for a minute to Le Figaro and the headline, The Start of a New Era for Ankara and Europe. This piece reminds us that during the campaign trail, Erdogan insisted that the vote would show a lesson to the Europeans who've been trying to intimidate Turkey in recent months. And now, for this paper, Turkey could now be emboldened to make good on that threat and a number of threats we heard from Turkey in recent months. On a number of fronts. Everything from the Syrian civil war that's, of course, still raging on Turkey's doorstep to the refugee crisis. What's more, with Turkey last night insisting that the country would bring back the death penalty, it seems, we read here, that Turkey's long-held ambitions to join the European Union are now rapidly fading. Erdogan's creeping authoritarianism and demagoguery, according to this paper, should be cause for alarm for European leaders.
Right, well, speaking of demagoguery, over here in France, President Hollande has been talking about just that.
He has, but with less than a week to go before France heads to the polls, he was, of course, speaking in an election context, unsurprisingly, addressing a crowd at an event to mark the bloody World War I battle of the Chemin des Dames. Hollande's speech was, we read here, distinctly political in tone, perhaps more political than you'd expect from this sort of address. Hollande said that history begins to falter when nationalism is allowed to flourish. It can appear in different forms, but there's always the same hate underneath it all. So that, of course, a not-so-veiled reference to the National Front Party, whose leader, Marine Le Pen, is very likely to make it through to the presidential runoff next month. But Hollande hasn't just been taking aim at his far-right nemesis. Le Figaro is also reporting that Hollande is ramping up his criticism of far-left presidential candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Mélenchon, who, it's important to say, is currently surging in the polls. In an interview aired on Sunday night, the president said the leader of the France Insoumise, or rebellious France movement, has a tendency to slip into oversimplification, especially with regard to NATO, Russia, and the EU. So rather damning criticism of Mélenchon there by François Hollande.
Indeed it is. Now, you found a piece that points out to some potential similarity, let's say, between the two non-traditional candidates to which you just referred.
Yeah, so there is, of course, a very real possibility that we'll be seeing Mélenchon up against Le Pen in the second round. We kind of thought that might be, I think that seemed impossible just a few months ago, but it's a possibility. So this is actually quite interesting. It's a piece in Le Monde that sees distinct similarities in both candidates' positions on the future of Syrian strongman Bashar al-Assad. Le Pen has previously described Syria as facing a binary choice between Assad on one hand and the Islamic State organisation on the other, the former being instrumental in the defeat of the latter. So she really she's stating her claim quite clearly there. She is pro-Assad. Mélenchon, meanwhile, we read, sees Assad not as an oppressive dictator, but rather as a leader who is bravely resisting gas companies' attempts to install pipelines in his country. So while Le Pen's support of Assad is explicit, we read here, Mélenchon's is a little more camouflaged. But both of them, insists this author, have consigned the Syrian people to the dustbin of history.
All right, let's end with a rather powerful front page from the sports daily L'Équipe.
Yes, so à pleurer, shameful, reads this headline above a photo of Bastia fans fighting with Lyon players during a Ligue 1 match between the two sides. The match was abandoned at half-time when home fans invaded the pitch in Corsica, although the game was almost called off before it had even begun when Bastia fans tried to attack visiting Lyon players during their warm-up. And later in the paper, there's a piece that laments a terrible week for football. There was, of course, the suspected terrorist attack on that Dortmund bus, clashes between Besiktas and Lyon fans at their team's meeting at the Europa League quarter-final, and now this, of course. Tournaments that can't ensure the safety of their players and fans, we read here, risk losing everything, and I'm quoting there. This piece insists that, once again, it's time to clean up the beautiful game.
All right, Haxi, yes, some very disturbing images there from Sunday night's match. All right, thank you very much for the French papers roundup.